The ships came down from the sky on a cold October morning. They were beautiful in a terrible way, silver and smooth like giant teardrops falling through the clouds. People stopped in the streets to watch them. Some ran. Most just stood there, unable to move, unable to believe what their eyes were telling them. The first day was chaos. Armies fired missiles and jets scrambled into the air, but it made no difference. They had weapons that could shut down anything electronic with a pulse of light. Tanks stopped moving. Planes fell from the sky. Nuclear submarines lost power and drifted helplessly in the dark ocean. In 72 hours, every military on Earth was broken. The aliens did not come to destroy humanity. They made that clear very quickly. They came to manage it. Within a week, administrators landed in every major city. They were tall creatures, almost 8 feet, with pale blue skin and large dark eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. They wore simple gray robes and spoke through small floating drones that translated their clicking language into human words. Their voices came out flat and calm, like someone reading instructions from a manual. They called themselves the Dominion, and they had done this before. Earth was not the first world they had taken. They showed humans images of other planets, other species living peacefully under their rule. See, they said, cooperation brings prosperity. Resistance brings suffering. The choice is simple. Most human governments chose cooperation. What else could they do? Their weapons were useless. Their armies were scattered. They offered them a deal. Keep your positions, keep your titles, help us maintain order, and we will make your world better than it has ever been. Many leaders accepted. They appeared on television looking tired and defeated, telling their people to stay calm, to go back to work, to trust that everything would be fine. And for a while, it almost seemed like they were right. They did bring improvements. They built new power plants that ran on clean energy and never broke down. They gave doctors medical devices that could heal wounds in minutes and cure cancers in days. They ended wars that humans had been fighting for generations, simply by refusing to allow them to continue. Crime rates dropped because the surveillance drones were everywhere, watching everything, and punishment for breaking their laws was swift and certain. In exchange, humanity had to work. The aliens wanted minerals from the Earth, rare metals and chemicals that their technology required. They wanted food grown in massive farms that stretched for hundreds of miles. They wanted products built in factories that ran day and night. Humans were given quotas to fill, schedules to keep, rules to follow. It was not slavery, they insisted. Workers were paid. They had homes and food and medicine. They just did not have freedom. 3 years passed. The occupation became normal. Children grew up knowing nothing else. Young people learned the language in school alongside their own. Adults went to work in the mornings and came home in the evenings, just as they always had, except now there were alien administrators watching over everything they did. The world kept turning and people kept living, and slowly the memory of what life had been like before began to fade. They were pleased with themselves. They filed reports back to their describing Earth as a perfect example of peaceful integration. The humans were cooperative, productive, and broken. They had accepted their place in the Dominion without serious resistance. It was, the administrators agreed, one of their smoothest acquisitions ever. They were wrong. In a small apartment inn, an old woman named Maria sat by her window every morning, watching the patrol pass by. She sold fruit at a market stall during the day, smiling at the aliens when they came to inspect, bowing her head respectfully when they spoke to her. But every night she wrote down what she had seen in a small notebook. Patrol times, route changes, which administrators were stationed where. She had been doing this for 3 years, and she was not the only one. In Osaka, a factory worker named had a similar routine. He assembled parts for communication devices, working 12 hours a day under the watchful eyes of drone supervisors. He never complained. He never made mistakes. He was the perfect worker. But he paid attention to everything around him, and in his mind he built a complete map of the alien communication network. He knew which towers talked to which frequencies they used, which systems were most vulnerable. He shared this information with others, passed along in whispered conversations during shift changes. In Lagos, a teenage girl named found a box of discarded documents behind an administrative building. Most humans would have thrown them away, afraid to be caught with alien materials. Kept them. She studied them for months, comparing the strange symbols to the translated announcements the broadcast daily. Slowly, painfully, she taught herself to read their language. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she kept going, knowing that understanding the enemy was the first step to defeating them. In Colorado, a woman named worked as a cleaner in a human government building that they used as a regional headquarters. Before the occupation, she had been a signals officer in the military. Now she mopped floors and emptied trash cans, invisible and ignored. At night, she went home to her basement, where she had spent 3 years building shortwave radios from scraps and stolen parts. They monitored all digital communication, but they did not think to monitor old technology that humanity had abandoned decades ago. Sent coded messages to people she had never met, connecting fragments of a network that spread across the entire world. There were thousands like them, millions perhaps, people who smiled at the aliens during the day and planned against them at night, people who seemed broken but were not, people who remembered what freedom felt like and refused to accept that it was gone forever. They had studied human history before they came. They knew about wars and conquests, about empires rising and falling, but they had focused on the wrong stories. They studied the peoples who had been conquered and stayed conquered, the nations that had accepted defeat and moved on. They did not pay enough attention to the others, the resistance movements that had outlasted occupiers, the underground networks that had survived decades of oppression, the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things simply because they refused to give up. The aliens saw a species that had surrendered. They did not see what was growing in the shadows. In meeting rooms and living rooms, in factory break areas and market stalls, humans talked in careful words that meant nothing to listening drones but everything to each other. They developed hand signals and code phrases. They left chalk marks on walls that told stories to those who knew how to read them. They taught children songs that contained hidden messages, melodies that sounded innocent but carried information across neighborhoods and cities. They shared what they knew. Maria's patrol schedules reached people in Ayers and Mexico City. Communication maps spread through networks in Seoul and Beijing. Translations helped cells in Nairobi and Cairo understand orders before they were announced. This radio network connected them all, a web of whispers that spanned the globe. The administrators went about their work, confident and calm. They counted their resources and met their quotas and sent their reports. They walked through human streets and saw obedient workers and cooperating leaders and a conquered species learning its place. They did not see the fire burning behind human eyes. They did not hear the planning happening in spaces they did not know existed. They did not understand that every act of compliance was a mask, every bow and smile a deception. Humanity was waiting, watching, learning, preparing. And when the time came, they would strike everywhere at once. The signal came on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. It traveled through radio network, jumping from transmitter to transmitter across mountains and oceans, reaching every cell that had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. The message was simple, just 3 words repeated over and over: the sun rises. Maria heard it on the small radio hidden beneath her bed. She got up slowly, her old bones aching, and walked to her window. Outside, the streets were waking up, people heading to work, patrols making their rounds. Everything looked normal. Everything was about to change. She picked up her phone and made a call to a number she had memorized years ago. She spoke 2 words and hung up. Then she made another call and another. Each call took less than 10 seconds. Each one set something in motion. Across the world, the same thing was happening. In Osaka, finished his morning coffee and sent a text message to 3 contacts. In Lagos, knocked on her neighbor's door and spoke a phrase that made the older woman's eyes widen with understanding. In Colorado, sat at her radio and began transmitting final instructions to stations on every continent. At exactly 9 o'clock time, the lights went out. Not everywhere. They were not stupid, and a total blackout would have been suspicious. But in very specific places, power suddenly failed. The administrative building in Berlin lost electricity while the shops across the street stayed lit. The Patrol Coordination Center in Tokyo went dark while the trains kept running. In city after city, facilities found themselves cut off, their backup generators sabotaged days or weeks earlier by maintenance workers who had been waiting for this moment. The aliens responded quickly, sending repair crews and backup units. But the repair crews found roads blocked by accidents that had happened at exactly the right time. The backup units walked into ambushes, humans appearing from alleys and rooftops to capture weapons and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Every response the made had been predicted, planned for, and countered. Regional Commander stood in the emergency-lit command center in Berlin, watching reports flood in from around the world. His skin had gone pale with shock. His large, dark eyes moved from screen to screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "How many cells?" he asked his intelligence officer. The officer hesitated. The patterns on his skin shifted with distress. "We are still counting, Commander. Current estimates suggest all of them." "All of what?" "All of the settlements. Every human population center above 10,000 individuals appears to have an active resistance cell. Many have multiple cells working independently." Felt something he had not experienced in 200 years, fear, real fear. They had occupied many worlds and faced rebellions before, but those had been desperate, disorganized uprisings, easy to find, easy to crush. This was different. This was happening everywhere at the same time, coordinated without any central coordination they could identify. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "We monitor their communications, we watch everything." "They were not using our communications, Commander. They were using other methods, radio frequencies we considered obsolete, physical messages passed by hand, code languages we did not recognize. They built an entire network and we never saw it." Within hours, the situation grew worse. The administrator woke to find that every door in his compound had been locked from outside. The codes changed sometime during the night. In Mumbai, a patrol unit was surrounded by hundreds of humans who simply stood in their path, blocking movement without violence, forcing the aliens to wait while other operations proceeded elsewhere. In Sydney, barricades had appeared around the entire quarter overnight, constructed from cars and furniture and debris that would take days to clear. In Lagos, administrator checked her secure equipment and found it missing, all of it. The security system showed nothing unusual, but everything valuable was gone. When she tried to contact her staff, half of them did not answer. The other half had already fled the city, seeking safety in the countryside. The humans were not trying to defeat them in battle. They understood they could not win that way. Instead, they were making occupation impossible. Every system the aliens relied on was being disrupted. Every assumption they had made was being proven wrong. The ordered, cooperative, broken humanity they thought they knew had vanished overnight, replaced by something far more dangerous. Factories stopped producing equipment. The workers had simply not shown up, and when replacement workers were ordered in, they found the machines sabotaged in ways that would take weeks to repair. Similar stories came from manufacturing centers around the world. The productivity that the Dominion prized so highly collapsed in a single day. Transportation networks fell apart. Truck drivers refused to move cargo. Train operators found signals malfunctioning. Ship captains reported engine problems that kept their vessels in port. They had spent 3 years building an efficient system for extracting Earth's resources, and that system was now completely paralyzed. Even the administrators who had not been directly attacked found themselves isolated. Their human staff stopped following orders. Their translators stopped translating accurately. The local leaders who had cooperated with the occupation suddenly became unavailable, claiming illness or emergency or simply vanishing from their offices. Commander tried to organize a response. He ordered troops to key locations, demanded reinforcements from other regions, attempted to establish communication with the Dominion. But everything took longer than it should. Every order encountered unexpected obstacles. Every plan met resistance before it could be implemented. He began to realize that the humans had not just prepared for this day. They had prepared for every possible response. They had studied for 3 years, learning their methods, their habits, their weaknesses. They knew how the aliens would react, and they had planned accordingly. A week into the uprising, received a report that made him sit down heavily in his chair. 47 cities were now considered unsecured, not because the humans had seized them through violence, but because authority there had simply ceased to exist. Administrators had been captured or driven out. Equipment had been destroyed or taken. The aliens who remained were hiding, waiting for rescue that might never come. "They are not fighting us," Said observed quietly. "They are making us irrelevant." It was true. The humans had understood something they had not considered. An occupation only works when the occupied people participate in it. They had to go to work, follow rules, accept authority. When they stopped doing those things all at once, there was nothing the occupiers could do except leave. By the end of the month, the resistance had claimed another 70 cities. Casualties remained relatively low because the humans avoided direct combat whenever possible. They did not want to kill the aliens. They wanted them gone. And one by one, outpost by outpost, facility by facility, they were making that happen. Sat in a captured administrative building in Lagos, reading through documents with a speed that amazed even herself. 3 years of study had made her fluent in their language, and now she was putting that knowledge to work. She translated communications, identified supply routes, and predicted where the aliens would try to reinforce their positions. Her information saved lives and won victories across the continent. Maria had stopped selling fruit. She now coordinated resistance cells across South America from a hidden basement, her networks of whispers grown into a command structure that they could not see or understand. Every night she received reports of small triumphs, of aliens withdrawing, of humanity taking back what belonged to it. Had moved her radio station to a new location, deeper underground, protected by hundreds of people who would die before they let them find it. Her broadcasts now reached not just Earth but ships in orbit. She was not transmitting to aliens, of course. She was letting every human who could hear know that they were winning. And in Osaka, had finally stopped pretending to be an obedient worker. He stood on the roof of the factory where he had labored for 3 years, watching transports lift off from the city, carrying administrators and soldiers who had decided that being elsewhere was better than staying here. He did not cheer. Too many people had died for that, but he allowed himself a small smile. The sun was rising, and humanity was rising with it. High Commander stood at the observation window of the Eternal Dominion, watching Earth turn slowly below. From up here, it looked peaceful. Blue and green and white, a beautiful world that had seemed like such a perfect acquisition 3 years ago. Now it was the site of the greatest humiliation in Dominion history. Admiral entered the command center, his footsteps heavy with reluctance. He had been a strong supporter of the Earth operation from the beginning, promising easy resources and minimal resistance. Now he could not meet eyes. "The final numbers, Commander," he said quietly. Took the report and read it slowly. 43 killed in the past month, 212 wounded, over 3,000 missing. That last number was the worst. Missing meant captured, and the humans refused to negotiate for prisoners. They did not harm them, the intelligence suggested. They simply held them somewhere the Dominion could not find. We could pacify them, said, though his voice carried no conviction. Orbital bombardment of key population centers. We have done it before. On worlds with millions of inhabitants concentrated in small areas, replied. Earth has 8 billion people spread across every landmass. We would have to burn the entire surface to guarantee compliance. And then what would we have? A dead world that produces nothing. He turned away from the window. His staff stood around the room, waiting for orders, waiting for a solution. He had none to give them. The truth was simple and painful. They had conquered 17 species across 4 star systems. They had faced rebellions on many worlds, desperate uprisings that burned bright and brief before being crushed. But they had never faced anything like this. The humans had not risen up in rage and been defeated. They had waited, planned, and struck with precision that the Dominion could not counter. Every time they adapted, the humans adapted faster. When patrols were increased, the humans found new ways to avoid them. When communication systems were secured, they used methods the Dominion had never considered monitoring. When force was applied, they simply vanished, only to reappear somewhere else, taking back another piece of their world. They could not be intimidated because they did not fear death the way the expected conquered peoples to fear it. They had calculated the cost of resistance and decided it was worth paying. They had looked at the overwhelming power of the Dominion and said, no, we will not accept this. It was, had to admit, impressive, terrifying but impressive. We cannot hold this world, he said finally. The words fell like stones into the silent room. Stared at him. Commander, if we withdraw, the precedent alone will cause problems. Other occupied species will see that resistance can succeed. Other occupied species are not like humans, replied. We spent 3 years studying them and still did not understand what we were dealing with. They are different, difficult, impossible perhaps. He made a decision. It was not an easy one, but it was the only one that made sense. The Dominion did not waste resources on lost causes, and Earth had become exactly that. Begin evacuation procedures, he ordered. All personnel, all equipment, all records. I want nothing left behind that they could use against us. The evacuation began in June. Transports descended from orbit to collect administrators and soldiers from the remaining secure positions. Many of those positions were no longer secure by the time the transports arrived, forcing hurried relocations and emergency extractions. The humans did not attack the departing aliens directly, but they made the withdrawal as difficult as possible, blocking roads and cutting power and creating chaos that slowed everything down. Maria watched from her window as the silver ships rose into the sky above the city. She had spent 3 years of her life working toward this moment, and now that it had come, she felt only tired. So many people had died. So many families had lost loved ones. The victory was real, but it did not feel like celebration. Stood on a hillside outside Osaka, surrounded by fellow workers who had become fellow soldiers. They watched the last transport lift off from the ruins of the regional headquarters. No one cheered. They had all lost too much for that. But there was something in their faces, something quiet and fierce, that said they understood what this meant. Walked through the streets of Lagos, past buildings that had been administrative centers and were now just empty shells. Children ran past her, laughing and playing, too young to remember a time before the occupation. She hoped they would grow up in a world where this never happened again. She would do everything she could to make sure of it. Sat at her radio, broadcasting for what might be the last time. Her voice went out across the world, reaching people in mountains and valleys, in cities and villages, in every place where humans had fought and waited and refused to surrender. She did not give a speech. She simply said that it was over. They had won. Across the planet, people heard her words and finally allowed themselves to believe. The Eternal Dominion left Earth orbit on a cool June evening, stood at the observation window one last time, watching the blue-green world grow smaller behind them. He had files to update, reports to file, explanations to give to the Dominion leadership. He would tell them the truth, that Earth could not be held, that the humans were too dangerous, that the cost of occupation exceeded any possible benefit. But there was more to it than that, and he knew it. They had not just failed to conquer Earth. They had learned something about the humans that changed everything. Other species accepted occupation because they calculated that resistance was futile. They looked at the power of the Dominion and made a rational decision to survive by cooperating. The humans had made a different calculation. They had decided that some things were more important than survival: freedom, dignity, the right to determine their own future. They were willing to die for these things, and that willingness made them unconquerable. Would recommend that Earth be reclassified in the Dominion databases, not as a failed acquisition, not as a strategic withdrawal, but as something far more significant, a species to be avoided, a world to be left alone. On Earth, the celebrations were quiet and brief. There was too much work to do. Cities had to be rebuilt. Systems had to be restored. Governments had to be reformed. The world that emerged from occupation would not be the same as the one that had existed before it, and no one knew yet what it would become. But there was hope. That was the important thing. For the first time in 3 years, people could look at the future without fear. Maria returned to her market stall. She was too old to rebuild cities or reform governments, but she could sell fruit again, and that was enough. When customers came, she smiled at them, and now the smile was real. Went back to his factory. The machines had been repaired, and soon they would be producing again. But they would produce what humans needed, not what aliens demanded. He took pride in his work for the first time in years. Began teaching. There were not enough schools, not enough teachers, and the education system had been destroyed by the occupation. She gathered children in her neighborhood and taught them to read, to write, to think for themselves. She taught them history, including the history they had just lived through. She wanted them to understand what their parents and grandparents had done and why it mattered. Kept her radio network running. The original purpose was gone, but she saw new possibilities. Communication would be vital in the years ahead, and she had built something that connected people across the world. She began adapting it for peacetime, creating channels for news and coordination, and the simple human need to talk to each other. In the files of the Dominion, Earth was marked with a warning. The species there is not to be contacted or approached. Any vessel entering their system does so at its own risk. The humans had won not through superior weapons or technology, but through something they had failed to account for: the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to accept that defeat was inevitable. It was, the surviving administrators agreed, the most human thing they had ever witnessed. And somewhere in the vastness of space, a species that had conquered worlds across the galaxy had learned a lesson they would never forget. Some peoples were not meant to be ruled. Some worlds were not meant to be taken. And sometimes, the greatest victory was simply refusing to surrender. On Earth, the sun continued to rise each morning just as it always had. The occupation was over. Freedom had returned. And humanity, but unbroken, looked toward a future that belonged only to them.